Welcome to our exploration of strange story of Alabama's borders, a story filled with surveying errors, geographic quirks, and the surprising history that has shaped the state lines you see today. Most people think state borders are neat and logical, straight lines, sometimes following rivers or mountain ridges. But Alabama's boundary with its neighbors? Far from perfect. From wiggly lines along rivers to corners that don't seem to match up on the map, there's more to Alabama's borders than meets the eye. In this video, we'll trace Alabama's borders, how they were determined, the errors that crept in, and what legacy those mistakes left behind. By the end, you'll not only see why the borders are odd, you'll also understand how those oddities affect things like county jurisdiction, land ownership, and even state identity. You're watching Obscured History, revealing the forgotten stories that shaped our past. Alabama sits at the very heart of the American South, bordered by Tennessee to the north, Georgia to the east, Florida to the south, and Mississippi to the west. At first glance, its state lines may look straightforward, just simple marks drawn on a map. But take a closer look, and you'll see that Alabama's borders are anything but ordinary. Hidden within these lines are centuries of mistakes, surveying errors, political arguments, and quirky decisions that shaped the state in ways most people have never heard about. From the strange sliver of coastline that gives Alabama only a tiny window to the Gulf of Mexico, to the oddly jagged borders shared with Mississippi and Georgia, every line tells a story. These borders were influenced by explorers who miscalculated distances, politicians who fought over land, and human errors that were never corrected. The result is a patchwork of boundaries that reveal just how messy and complicated America's past really was. Borders are far more than just lines on a map. They define identity, determine who controls valuable resources, and even decide which laws and governments people live under. And when you look at Alabama, those borders tell a story that goes far beyond geography. They reveal centuries of colonial ambitions, land disputes, and human mistakes that left permanent marks on the map. To understand why Alabama looks the way it does today, we need to travel back to the 1700s and 1800s, when maps were often vague and surveying tools were primitive. Back then, powerful nations like Britain, Spain, and later the young United States fought to claim land, redraw boundaries, and secure influence. Every decision, whether it was a treaty, a surveying line, or even a simple miscalculation, helped shape the unusual borders we see today. Alabama's jagged edges and peculiar lines are not accidents, but the result of politics, exploration, and the errors of the past. Let's begin at the most elevated point, Alabama's northern extent, jointed with Tennessee. This particular line was contemplated to be established along the 35th parallel north. However, during the early stages of mapping, these researchers didn't possess GPS devices. Instead, they relied on more basic tools and made their judgments based on insufficient data. Consequently, the final positioning deviated too much to the south. This mistake left Alabama with an inability to gain a hold of vital land resources, and in some instances, it even came to be questionable if they deserved a slice of the Tennessee River they enthusiastically desired. This surveying error didn't just stay on paper, it sparked real conflict. Alabama argued that the mistake had cost the state valuable land along the Tennessee River, land that would have provided stronger trade routes, better navigation, and direct access to resources that could boost its economy. Losing that stretch of river meant losing opportunity, and Alabama leaders made their frustration clear. Tennessee, however, refused to surrender an inch. Despite Alabama's protests, the faulty line was accepted, mistakes and all, and eventually hardened into the official state boundary. To this day, the line remains exactly where those early surveyors placed it, wrong or not. What makes it even more fascinating is that the disagreement never truly disappeared. Even now, Alabama citizens occasionally point to that lost territory and argue that history shortchanged them. It's a reminder that borders are not just abstract lines. They carry weight, stir emotion, and in Alabama's case, still spark tension more than 2 centuries after the original mistake. On the east, the winding border meanders along the picturesque Chattahoochee River. However, rivers are living beings that stir, swell, and shift in response to various factors. Over time, individuals and families have discovered that their properties have inexplicably changed states without ever physically moving. This curious occurrence has left the Chattahoochee River contributing to Alabama's natural boundary while also serving as a seemingly infinite source of disputes and misunderstandings. The river may have seemed like the perfect boundary at the time. It was rich with resources, a lifeline for farming communities, and served as a natural highway for trade and travel. But there was one problem: rivers never stay still. They shift, flood, and carve new paths. By tying a state line to a moving river, lawmakers unintentionally guaranteed generations of legal disputes. As the river changed, so did the questions of who owned the water, who could build dams, and who had the right to use it for drinking, farming, and industry. These weren't just small disagreements. They shaped economies and communities on both sides of the border. Even today, Alabama and Georgia find themselves at odds in courtroom battles and political negotiations over water rights. What began as a simple decision in the 1800s has grown into a lasting conflict, proving that a border set more than 2 centuries ago still impacts daily life in the American South. Now let's look south, where Alabama touches the Gulf of Mexico. If you glance at the map, you'll notice something surprising. Alabama's Gulf Coast is shockingly short, stretching only about 60 miles. For a state its size, that's barely enough to call itself a Gulf state. So why is it so narrow? The answer lies in history and international politics. When the United States was carving out state lines in the early 1800s, Spain still controlled Florida, and Spain guarded its long Gulf coastline fiercely, refusing to give up more territory than necessary. As a result, Alabama was left with only a thin slice of shoreline, just enough for a port at Mobile Bay, but nothing like the broad coastlines of Texas, Louisiana, or even its neighbor Florida. That short strip of beach was a compromise, a reminder that the young United States often had to balance ambition with reality. To this day, Alabama remains a Gulf state in name, but one with the shortest coastline of them all, an outcome decided not by geography alone, but by international politics and hard bargaining. That strip includes Mobile Bay, Alabama's only true gateway to the Gulf. It became a hub for trade and shipping, vital to the state's growth. But the short coastline also exposed Alabama's weakness: limited access to the sea. Unlike Florida's vast shoreline, Alabama was left with just 60 miles, and even today its coastal economy is only a fraction of its neighbors. At first glance, Alabama's western line with Mississippi appears perfectly straight, but that clean look on a map hides a much more complicated reality. When the boundary was first surveyed, men had to trudge through dense forests, swamps, and rivers with only basic tools to guide them. The terrain was unforgiving, and precise measurements were nearly impossible. Not surprisingly, mistakes piled up. Some markers were set in the wrong places, while others shifted over time. These small errors created big consequences. Property lines overlapped, landowners argued over deeds, and counties were forced into odd shapes to accommodate the mistakes. The confusion didn't end there. Generations later, survey records and maps still don't always line up, leaving historians and locals puzzled by inconsistencies. What looks like a neat, straight border today is actually the product of human error, imperfect technology, and the challenges of carving order out of wilderness. Alabama's western edge is a reminder that even the simplest-looking lines often have the most complicated stories. These borders were not merely defined by geographical considerations. They held significant power implications as well. Political leaders were more focused on establishing trade routes and controlling land territories rather than striving for perfectly rectilinear borders. The unusual shape of Alabama can be observed as a reflection of these historical decisions and the inherent compromises that were made when the state was carved from the lands of colonial settlers and indigenous tribes. Before Alabama became a state, it was the homeland of the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. These nations had lived here for centuries, shaping the land with their farms, trade, and traditions. Their cultures were deeply rooted in the rivers and forests, long before settlers ever drew lines on a map. But expansion came swiftly and ruthlessly. Treaties were broken, lands were seized, and resistance was met with war. Alabama's borders were drawn without native voices, carved across homelands they never agreed to give up. These lines were made for settlers and politicians, not for the people who had called this place home for generations. Every crooked edge of the map tells that story. They are not accidents of surveying. They are reminders of removal, loss, and survival. From the Creek War to the Trail of Tears, families were torn from their homeland, yet their legacy endures. Alabama's borders are more than geography. They are scars, etched into the land itself. Georgia and Alabama have clashed over their shared border for centuries. What might look like a simple line on a map often turned into real conflict on the ground. Ferry operators didn't always know which state's taxes to collect. Traders sometimes paid duties twice, once to each state, and in small towns split by the border, families often found themselves caught between two sets of laws that didn't always agree. For local residents, this created daily confusion. A business owner could open shop under one state's rules in the morning and be told he was violating another state's law by evening. Neighbors argued over property lines, sheriffs disagreed on authority, and court cases dragged on for years, all because the boundary was never firmly settled. Even today, echoes of that uncertainty remain. In border towns, people still joke that stepping across the street can mean stepping into a completely different legal system. What looks like a simple state line has always been a point of friction, shaping life along the Georgia-Alabama border in surprising and often frustrating ways. Water has kept the border dispute between Alabama and Tennessee alive for centuries. Alabama claims that surveying errors long ago unfairly limited its access to the Tennessee River, a vital resource for trade, transportation, and industry. Tennessee, however, insists the lines are correct, arguing that history and law back its claim. The disagreement has sparked heated debates in state legislatures, with some lawmakers even suggesting redrawing the border in modern times. Maps, legal documents, and surveys have all been scrutinized. But despite decades of discussion, the boundary remains exactly where it was drawn. Imperfections, mistakes, and all. Today, that line stands as a reminder of human error and compromise, showing how even water can carry the weight of history. If Alabama could rewrite history, it would claim more coastline along the Gulf of Mexico. Today, the state has just about 60 miles of shore, a narrow stretch that limits trade, tourism, and naval development. Mobile Bay serves as the state's crucial gateway, but it can't replace the advantages of a wider shoreline. Florida, by contrast, boasts endless beaches, bustling ports, and thriving coastal cities. Tourists, trade, and naval facilities flourish there, while Alabama has had to make do with far less. That narrow access has shaped the state's economy and opportunities for generations. Alabama's coastline is more than just a line on a map. It's a reminder of how history and geography can shape a state. Mobile Bay remains a lifeline, but the state's longing for more access shows how even small stretches of water can leave a big mark on its story. To understand how these mistakes happened, we have to imagine surveying in the early 1800s. Back then, there were no satellites or advanced equipment. Crews worked with simple tools, heavy chains, compasses, and rough astronomical readings. Every step had to be measured by hand, every angle judged by eye. Now place those crews in dense forests, rugged hills, and mosquito-filled swamps. The heat, the mud, and the sheer difficulty of travel made precise work nearly impossible. Even the best surveyors faced constant errors, whether from miscalculations, broken equipment, or sheer exhaustion in the wilderness. And yet, those flawed lines, drawn under such harsh conditions, became permanent law. What was meant as a rough guide ended up defining state borders, shaping economies, and influencing politics for centuries to come. The mistakes of surveyors with chains and compasses still mark the maps we use today. Even within Alabama itself, the borders are far from simple. Many county lines were drawn to follow rivers or natural features, while others twist and bend because of surveying mistakes made more than a century ago. What may look like random shapes on a map often reflects the challenges of early mapping and the compromises of local politics. These quirks aren't just historical curiosities. They still affect people's lives today. A family living on one side of a crooked county line might pay different taxes, send their children to a different school district, or rely on different emergency services than their neighbors just down the road. Alabama's odd boundaries continue to shape daily life in ways most people never even notice. For border communities, these quirks aren't just history, they're daily life. Farmers who haul crops across the Georgia line sometimes face a whole new set of rules just a few miles from home. Fishermen working waters near Tennessee often clash over who has the right to cast their nets. And truckers passing through Alabama's narrow strip of Gulf Coast rely on that sliver of shoreline for access to international trade. These borders may look like abstract lines on a map, but for the people who live and work along them, they shape real opportunities, challenges, and livelihoods. Each crooked edge carries consequences, influencing how goods are sold, how resources are shared, and how communities survive on the shifting boundaries between states. When we zoom out, Alabama's borders reveal more than geography. They are the result of surveying mistakes, political deals, and power struggles that shaped the South. Every misplaced line reflects choices made by leaders who valued trade routes and resources more than accuracy. These quirks remind us that maps aren't purely scientific. They are human records, flawed, contested, and deeply political. Alabama's borders still carry those old decisions, influencing the state's identity and daily life even today. At first glance, Alabama's borders appear straightforward, neat lines on a map, dividing one state from another. But look closer, and the flaws begin to surface. The northern boundary was mistakenly set too far south, costing Alabama valuable access to the Tennessee River. Along the Gulf, the state's coastline is unusually short, barely 60 miles, leaving it at a disadvantage compared to its neighbors. Even the rivers that were meant to serve as natural boundaries instead created confusion, disputes, and lasting tension. This is more than cartographic error. It is the strange story of Alabama's borders, a tale shaped by human mistakes, political deals, and forgotten conflicts. Every misplaced line reveals ambition, compromise, and the power struggles that carved the South. To explore more hidden stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Obscured History, where we uncover the past that maps and textbooks often leave behind.